When officers stopped the couple and beat the wife in front of her husband, a police captain, they had no idea who he really. Subscribe to the channel to stay tuned and post in the comments where you're watching us from. Captain Mark Williams, a tall, muscular black man with a chiseled jawline and a stern but thoughtful gaze, was no stranger to the dark realities of his job. As a seasoned officer in one of the city's most challenging police precincts, he had seen it all: drug busts gone wrong, domestic disputes spiraling into tragedy, and the raw, unfiltered brutality of the streets. Despite the weight of his uniform and the responsibilities it carried, Mark had always managed to uphold his commitment to justice and fairness, even in a system he knew was tainted with bias. But tonight was different. Tonight, Mark wasn't just a captain. He was a husband and a soon-to-be father, racing against time in a situation far more personal and urgent than anything he'd faced in his line of duty. Mark had been on the other side of town, finalizing some paperwork on a high-profile case, when he got the call from his wife, Lisa. Her voice had sounded tense, punctuated by sharp intakes of breath, as she explained that the contractions had started and were getting stronger by the minute. "I think it's time, Mark," she had said, her words laced with both excitement and fear. He could hear it in her voice, the apprehension, the hope, and the trust she placed in him to get her to safety. Leaving everything on his desk, Mark grabbed his keys and bolted out of the station. He had always prided himself on being calm under pressure, but this was different. The thought of his wife in pain, their unborn child on the way, filled him with a mix of adrenaline and dread he hadn't experienced before. As he sped through the city streets, his mind raced with questions. Would he make it in time? Would everything go smoothly? Would Lisa and their child be safe? He tried to reassure himself by remembering their carefully laid plans. They had prepared for this moment, gone through all the birthing classes, and talked endlessly about what they would do when the time came. But no amount of planning could prepare him for the rush of emotions that surged through him now. In the dimly lit streets, Mark pushed his car to its limits, accelerating past the usual speed limits, his eyes scanning for any signs of other vehicles or pedestrians. He knew he was breaking protocol, but he didn't care. Lisa needed him, and that was all that mattered. He turned on the emergency lights on his dashboard, hoping that any patrol officers who might spot him would understand that this was an urgent matter. As he weaved through traffic, memories of his life with Lisa began flooding his mind. They had met 8 years ago during one of his toughest cases. She had been working as a social worker, helping families affected by the same crime he was investigating. From the moment he saw her, he had been captivated by her strength, her compassion, and her unwavering commitment to justice. They had bonded over their shared values, their mutual understanding of the struggles faced by those on the margins of society, and their desire to make a difference. But even with their strong bond, Mark had always felt a lingering fear. He had seen firsthand the kind of world they lived in, a world where people were judged by the color of their skin, where assumptions were made before words were spoken, and where respect had to be earned through grit and resilience. He had witnessed discrimination in many forms, both subtle and overt, and he knew that his child, their child, would inherit a world still far from just. Now, as he raced through the city to be by Lisa's side, that fear felt more real than ever. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, mixed with the exhilaration of impending fatherhood. He was about to bring a new life into this world, a life he was determined to protect at all costs. But the closer he got to their apartment, the more another kind of apprehension settled in his gut. He knew that speeding through the city, even with his emergency lights on, was risky. He knew that, despite his badge, he was still a black man behind the wheel of a speeding car in a city where the lines of authority and prejudice often blurred. And, while he had hoped his career and reputation would protect him, he knew all too well that not everyone would see past his skin color. Finally, he arrived outside their building, screeching to a halt as he jumped out of the car and ran up the stairs 2 at a time. Bursting through the door, he found Lisa pacing the living room, clutching her stomach and breathing heavily. She looked up as he entered, her face a mixture of relief and pain. "Mark, thank God you're here," she managed between labored breaths. "I'm here, baby. Let's get you to the hospital," he said, wrapping an arm around her as he guided her back down the stairs and into the car. Once she was buckled in, he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his fingers gently tracing reassuring circles. As he sped toward the hospital, he tried to keep the atmosphere light, cracking jokes to distract her from the pain, but he couldn't shake the gnawing tension that lingered at the edge of his mind. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the road ahead and the woman he loved beside him. But then, as he made a sharp turn onto the main highway, the blue and red lights of a patrol car suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror, flashing insistently. His stomach clenched. He knew this wasn't good. Lisa, sensing his apprehension, looked at him with wide eyes. "Mark, they're pulling us over." "I know," he replied, his voice calm but tense. He took a deep breath, his mind racing as he weighed his options. He could try to explain the situation, appeal to the humanity of the officers, or he could keep driving and risk an escalation. But he knew that stopping was the only real choice. No matter how desperate he was, he couldn't afford to make things worse. Not now. Not with Lisa and their child so close to him. As he pulled over to the side of the road, he felt his pulse quicken, a sense of dread settling over him like a heavy fog. He turned to Lisa, his expression serious. "Let me handle this, all right?" he said softly, squeezing her hand. She nodded, her face pale with a mixture of pain and fear. The 2 officers approached the car, their expressions unreadable as they shone a flashlight into the vehicle. Mark felt a surge of frustration, knowing that he had done nothing wrong beyond trying to protect his family. But he pushed that feeling down, keeping his face neutral as he rolled down the window. "License and registration," one of the officers barked, his tone laced with suspicion. "My wife's in labor," Mark replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "We're just trying to get to the hospital." The officer's gaze flickered to Lisa, then back to Mark. There was a pause, a brief moment where Mark hoped that they might understand. But then the other officer stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "Step out of the car, sir," he said coldly. Mark's heart sank. He knew where this was going, and he knew there was little he could do to change their minds. As he opened the door and stepped out, he cast a final, reassuring look at Lisa, hoping to convey the words he couldn't say out loud. "I'll protect you, no matter what." Mark stood beside his car, hands visible, his posture relaxed but alert. He had trained countless officers in handling traffic stops, taught them how to defuse situations, how to read body language. But now, standing here, he found himself on the opposite side, hoping that these 2 men had learned the same lessons he'd tried to instill in others. The 2 officers were young, their stances rigid and expressions cold as they eyed him with open suspicion. One of them, a stocky man with a buzz cut, kept his hand close to his holster, fingers twitching as if ready to draw at the slightest provocation. The other officer, taller with piercing blue eyes, scanned Mark up and down with a look that bordered on disdain. "Sir, do you know how fast you were going back there?" the tall officer asked, his tone accusatory. "My wife's in labor," Mark replied, his voice measured. "I'm a police captain, and I'm just trying to get her to the hospital. Please, understand the situation here." The words hung in the air, but neither officer seemed moved. In fact, a shadow of a smirk appeared on the stocky officer's face, as if he found Mark's explanation amusing. "License and registration," the tall officer repeated, his voice cold. Mark could feel his frustration mounting, but he forced himself to remain calm. His badge, still clipped to his belt, should have made things clear, but he knew better than to assume it would shield him. "Look, I understand this looks bad, but I'm just trying to get my wife to the hospital," he said, trying to appeal to whatever humanity might be there. "If you need to check my credentials, go ahead, but please, she's in pain. Just let us go." The tall officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a silent exchange that made Mark's stomach turn. They weren't going to make this easy. "Step away from the car, sir," the stocky officer demanded, his tone sharper now. From inside the car, Lisa watched, her face twisted in pain, her breaths coming in quick gasps. She rolled down her window slightly, wincing as another contraction hit. "Please, officers," she pleaded, her voice strained. "I'm in labor. We really need to get to the hospital." The stocky officer looked over at her, his expression unchanging. "Ma'am, we need you to stay quiet and let us handle this." Mark's jaw clenched as he felt the familiar sting of anger rising in his chest. He had seen this look before, dismissive, doubting, as if the officers had already made up their minds about who he was and what kind of man he must be. They were no longer looking at a man who needed help. They were seeing a threat, an inconvenience, a black man in a situation they refused to understand. He forced himself to breathe, focusing on keeping his tone level. "I'm a police captain. I've been on the force for over 20 years. I understand protocol. But please, I'm asking for a bit of discretion here." But the tall officer only sneered, stepping closer until he was nearly in Mark's face. "And we're asking you to cooperate, Captain." The word came out like an insult, dripping with sarcasm. "Now, hands on the car." Mark's fist tightened involuntarily. Every instinct in him screamed against this. He knew his rights, and he knew that this treatment was unjust. But he also knew that if he didn't comply, things would only escalate. His wife's pained breaths filled his ears, grounding him, reminding him of what mattered. Slowly, he raised his hands and placed them on the roof of the car. He could feel the eyes of the officers on him, scrutinizing every movement, waiting for any excuse. It was a humiliating position, one that stripped him of his authority, his dignity. But he stayed silent, hoping that his cooperation might ease their hostility. From inside the car, Lisa watched in horror, her hands trembling as another contraction tore through her. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He could hear the desperation in her tone, and it broke his heart that he couldn't do more to reassure her. The stocky officer approached him from behind, his hands rough as he began to frisk Mark, patting him down with a force that felt more like punishment than protocol. Mark's muscles tensed, but he kept still, his focus entirely on Lisa and the baby she was about to bring into the world. Suddenly, Lisa couldn't take it anymore. Ignoring the pain, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out of the car. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she held herself upright, her face pale and strained. "Stop this, please!" she shouted, her voice shaky but firm. "This is insane. I'm in labor. Please, we need to go. The tall officer whirled around, glaring at her. "Ma'am, I told you to stay in the car." Lisa's eyes blazed with anger and fear. "You don't understand. He's not a threat. He's my husband, and he's just trying to help me. Why can't you see that?" The tall officer stepped closer to her, towering over her with an intimidating glare. "Get back in the car, or you'll be arrested for interfering." But Lisa stood her ground, even as the pain clawed at her. "Arrest me? For what? For being in pain? For needing help?" She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Please, just let us go." The stocky officer, seeing that Mark was watching, grabbed his arm and twisted it roughly behind his back. "Looks like you're resisting, Captain," he sneered, shoving Mark harder against the car. Mark gritted his teeth, holding back the urge to retaliate, to scream at them, to make them see him as a person rather than the threat they perceived. But then he heard Lisa scream. He turned, panic flooding his veins as he saw the tall officer grab Lisa's arm, pulling her back toward the car. She struggled against him, her face contorted in pain, and he could see her wince, her body racked by another contraction. "Let go of her!" Mark shouted, but his words fell on deaf ears. The tall officer tightened his grip on Lisa, clearly unmoved by her pleas. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to use force." Lisa's face was etched with fear and fury as she looked over at Mark, her eyes pleading for his help. But he was pinned, restrained by the stocky officer who seemed to enjoy every moment of the power he held. Desperation clawed at Mark's chest as he struggled to think of a way out, to find some way to make them understand. But every word he spoke only seemed to fuel their hostility. They weren't seeing a man or a husband. They were seeing a stereotype, a threat, a problem to be contained. Lisa's breaths grew ragged, her body trembling as she fought against the officer's hold. Her cries of pain cut through the night air, raw and unfiltered, a sound that sent chills down Mark's spine. Finally, unable to take it any more, she crumpled to the ground, clutching her stomach. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly taken aback, but they made no move to help her. Instead, they looked down at her with cold detachment, as if her pain were some kind of ruse. "Come on, ma'am," the tall officer muttered, his voice dripping with impatience. "We don't have time for this drama." Mark's vision blurred with fury and desperation as he struggled against the officer restraining him. "She's in labor, damn it, just let her go. Let us go." But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers seemed to relish the control they held, their expressions hard and unyielding. As Mark watched Lisa writhing in pain on the pavement, he felt a hollow ache settle in his chest, a sense of helplessness he hadn't felt in years. He was a captain, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law and protecting others, and yet here he was, powerless to protect the woman he loved. For a brief moment, he considered revealing his identity, telling them his name, his rank, his history, but he knew it wouldn't matter. In their eyes, he was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. He turned his gaze back to Lisa, his heart breaking as he watched her suffer, and silently promised himself that he would make them pay for this. He would make sure they faced the consequences of their actions. But right now, all he could do was endure, stay silent, and hope that somehow they would find a way out of this nightmare. Mark's pulse thudded in his ears as he watched Lisa on the ground, her face contorted in pain. The officer's cold indifference toward her suffering was like salt in a wound he could barely contain. Every instinct, every fiber in his being screamed at him to protect her, to tear these men away from her. But with his arms wrenched behind his back, his body pinned. He was helpless, forced to witness the nightmare unfold. The stocky officer's grip on Mark's arm tightened painfully, twisting his wrist until a sharp bolt of pain shot up his arm. "Not so tough now, are you, Captain?" he sneered, pressing down harder, forcing Mark's cheek against the cold metal of the car. Mark's jaw clenched as he fought the urge to lash out, every muscle in his body taut with fury. He was a trained officer. He knew how to handle conflict, how to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This was personal. They were hurting his wife, his family, and it took everything in him not to fight back. "Please, stop," Mark managed, his voice strained. "She's pregnant. Just let her go." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The tall officer ignored him, focusing instead on Lisa, who was struggling to pull herself up from the ground, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. She looked up at the officer, her eyes wide with a mix of pain and defiance. "Please, I need help." Lisa's voice was barely a whisper, each word laced with agony, but the officer only looked down at her with cold indifference, as though her suffering were an inconvenience rather than a call for compassion. Without warning, the tall officer grabbed her arm again, pulling her to her feet with a harsh tug. Lisa stumbled, clutching her stomach as another contraction ripped through her and a whimper escaped her lips. But the officer showed no sign of letting go, his hand gripping her arm tightly, leaving marks on her skin. "Stop faking," he snapped, his tone filled with disdain. "You're just trying to get him off the hook. It's not going to work." Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his vision blurring with rage as he watched his wife suffer under the hands of these men. He had seen cruelty before, but this was a new level of brutality. They weren't just indifferent, they were relishing her pain, feeding off it like vultures circling their prey. "Let her go," Mark shouted, struggling against the grip of the stocky officer, but his defiance only seemed to amuse them. The stocky officer twisted Mark's arm harder, forcing him down to his knees. "I said, stay still," he growled, delivering a hard jab to Mark's side with his knee, sending a fresh wave of pain through his body. "Resist an arrest, huh? You're just making it worse for yourself." From the corner of his eye, Mark saw Lisa stagger, her legs giving out as she fell back to the ground. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, and for a moment, sheer terror gripped him. This was supposed to be the happiest moment of their lives, bringing their child into the world together. Instead, it had turned into a waking nightmare, a nightmare he was powerless to stop. The tall officer crouched down beside Lisa, his eyes narrowing as he sneered at her. "What's the matter? Thought you'd put on a little show and we'd let you go?" Lisa looked up at him, her face twisted in pain but her gaze unwavering. Despite the agony, despite the fear, she met his eyes with a defiance that took even Mark by surprise. She wasn't backing down, not even in the face of this cruelty. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just let us go." But her plea only seemed to fuel the officer's anger. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her roughly. "You're nothing but a liar," he hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think we're stupid? Think we'll fall for your little act?" Mark could feel his control slipping, the anger boiling over, threatening to consume him. He couldn't take this anymore, couldn't stand by and watch as these men tormented the woman he loved. With a surge of strength born of sheer desperation, he wrenched his arm free from the stocky officer's grip, lurching forward toward Lisa. But before he could reach her, the stocky officer delivered a brutal blow to his back, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded in his ribs as he hit the pavement, the air knocked from his lungs. He lay there, gasping for breath, his vision swimming as he struggled to rise. "Stay down," the officer snarled, pressing his knee into Mark's back, pinning him to the ground. Mark's cheek scraped against the rough pavement, the taste of blood filling his mouth as he fought to breathe. But even through the haze of pain, his focus remained on Lisa, on the agony etched across her face. The tall officer finally released Lisa, letting her collapse to the ground. He straightened, looking down at her with a smug, satisfied expression. "Maybe now you'll learn to cooperate," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. Mark's heart twisted as he watched Lisa struggle to pull herself up, her hand pressed protectively against her stomach. Her face was pale, her breathing labored, and for a moment, sheer panic washed over him. Was their baby all right? Had these men, in their blind cruelty, hurt not just his wife, but their unborn child? But he had no time to dwell on the thought. The stocky officer grabbed him by the collar, hauling him to his feet with a rough jerk. "You think you're above the law, Captain?" he sneered, his face inches from Mark's. "Well, guess what? You're not, and neither is she." Mark's fists clenched, his entire body trembling with barely contained rage. He wanted to scream, to fight, to make them understand the damage they were doing. But he knew that any resistance would only make things worse. They held all the power here, and they knew it. Lisa looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and fear. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm in a silent plea for comfort. Mark met her gaze, his own eyes filled with helplessness. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He was supposed to protect her, to keep her safe. But now he was powerless, reduced to a helpless bystander in his own life. The tall officer stepped back, folding his arms across his chest as he watched them both with a smug grin. "You see, Captain," he said, his voice filled with mockery, "this is what happens when you think you're above the law." Mark's jaw tightened as he forced himself to stay calm, to keep his anger in check. But it was a losing battle. Every word, every sneer, every touch of their hands on Lisa sent a fresh wave of fury crashing through him. They were hurting her, humiliating her, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Are you done?" Mark finally managed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Or do you need to prove your point some more?" The tall officer's grin widened, clearly relishing the anger simmering beneath Mark's calm facade. "Oh, we're just getting started," he replied, his tone dripping with malice. "You think you can just break the law and get away with it? Not on our watch." Mark felt a fresh wave of despair wash over him as he realized just how deeply their hatred ran. This wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about power, about putting him in his place. They didn't care about justice, they cared about control, about reminding him of where they thought he belonged. But even as he stood there, humiliated and powerless, Mark made a silent promise to himself. This wasn't over. One way or another, he would make sure these men faced the consequences of their actions. He would fight for justice, for Lisa, for their child, and for everyone who had ever suffered under the weight of prejudice. But for now, he had no choice but to endure, to wait for the moment when he could finally reclaim the power they had stolen from him. The stocky officer finally released him, stepping back with a sneer. "Get out of here," he muttered, as though dismissing him like some unwanted stray. "But remember, we're watching you." Mark took a shaky breath, forcing himself to meet the officer's gaze. He didn't say a word, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing his anger. Instead, he turned to Lisa, his focus entirely on her. She reached for him, her hand trembling as he took it in his own, giving it a gentle squeeze. She was hurt, exhausted, but she managed a faint smile, her strength shining through the pain. "Let's go," he whispered, his voice barely audible as he helped her to her feet. As they made their way back to the car, Mark felt the weight of what had just happened settle heavily on his shoulders. This was far from over. He would fight, not just for his family, but for every person who had been made to feel powerless, for every voice silenced by hatred and ignorance. And as he looked at Lisa, he knew that together they would find a way to bring justice, no matter what it took. The world felt heavy as Mark helped Lisa into the car, his hands shaking with barely contained rage. She leaned against him, her body trembling, but her resolve was unbroken. The officers stood nearby, watching them with thinly veiled satisfaction, as though they had just reminded a disobedient child of his place. Mark gently closed the passenger door, then turned to look at them, his face a mask of forced composure. He could feel the sting of the bruises forming, the dull ache in his ribs from where they had struck him. But the real pain, the true wound, lay far deeper, a searing sense of betrayal by the very system he had dedicated his life to. As he walked around to the driver's side, a glint of light caught his eye. A pair of headlights approaching fast down the deserted street. His pulse quickened, and he squinted, his hand shielding his eyes against the glare. The car slowed, then stopped, and a familiar figure stepped out, his silhouette unmistakable even in the dim streetlights. It was Detective Jake Thompson, one of Mark's closest colleagues and someone he had known for years. Thompson was a grizzled veteran, known for his no-nonsense attitude and unwavering loyalty. Mark felt a surge of relief wash over him. If anyone could help make sense of this madness, it was Thompson. The two officers turned as the detective approached, their expressions shifting from smugness to unease. Clearly, they hadn't expected anyone to see what they'd done, least of all another officer who knew Mark well. Thompson's gaze flickered over the scene, taking in Mark's disheveled appearance, Lisa's pained expression in the car, and the tense stance of the two officers. His brows knitted together, a look of concern crossing his face as he stepped closer. "Mark?" he said, his voice low and steady, but with an edge of disbelief. "What's going on here?" Mark forced himself to take a steadying breath, meeting Thompson's gaze with a mix of relief and anger. "They pulled us over, Jake. Lisa's in labor, and they wouldn't let us go." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of the ordeal pressing down on him, but he steadied himself. "They used force. On both of us." Thompson's face darkened, his gaze shifting to the two officers with a look that could have cut steel. "Is that true?" he demanded, his voice colder than ice. The tall officer's face went pale, but he quickly straightened, attempting to put on a mask of professionalism. "Sir, the situation was unclear. We didn't know who he was, and there were some irregularities. We were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Thompson's tone was scathing, his eyes narrowing. "Your protocol involves assaulting a pregnant woman? In labor." The stocky officer cleared his throat, his posture defensive. "Sir, we had reason to believe they were non-compliant. They resisted, and we—" "Enough," Thompson cut him off, his voice sharp. "You think I don't know who Mark Williams is? He's a captain, a decorated officer. Do you think he'd just resist for no reason?" His gaze bore into them, leaving no room for their excuses. "I'll be filing a report on this. You can count on it." The tall officer's face flushed with embarrassment, and he glanced away, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Mark watched, a grim satisfaction building within him as he saw the officer's confidence drain away under Thompson's piercing stare. As Thompson turned to Mark, his expression softened, though his voice remained firm. "Are you all right? And Lisa?" Mark gave a slight nod, glancing toward the car where Lisa sat, her hand pressed protectively against her stomach. "We're okay. Just shaken." He hesitated, the rawness of the experience still fresh, before adding, "Thanks, Jake, for being here." Thompson's expression softened further, a trace of regret flickering in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Mark. This never should have happened." He shook his head, clearly struggling with his own anger. "We're supposed to protect people, not do this." For a brief moment, Mark felt the tension ease, the sense of solidarity with his colleague reminding him that there were still good people in the system, people who believed in justice, who wouldn't stand by and let power be abused. But the moment was fleeting, overshadowed by the reality of what had just happened. The two officers, now visibly uncomfortable, muttered hurried apologies, their previous arrogance replaced with fear. They avoided Mark's gaze, their shoulders hunched as they shuffled back to their patrol car, every step a silent acknowledgement of their failure. But Mark wasn't interested in their apologies. Words couldn't erase the pain they had inflicted, couldn't undo the fear and humiliation they had forced upon him and Lisa. He knew their apologies were hollow, driven more by the presence of a senior officer than by any genuine remorse. Thompson watched them retreat, his jaw clenched as he turned back to Mark. "I'll make sure they face the consequences. This isn't over." Mark nodded, though he knew that bringing these men to justice would be an uphill battle. The system was designed to protect its own, to bury incidents like this under layers of bureaucracy and silence. But, for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that change was possible, even if it came at a cost. With one last glance at the retreating officers, Thompson approached the car, leaning down to look at Lisa. "Ma'am, I'm sorry you had to go through this. Let me escort you both to the hospital." Lisa managed a faint smile, though her face was still etched with pain. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky but filled with gratitude. As Mark slid into the driver's seat, Thompson moved to his own car, his presence a silent promise of protection. Mark glanced over at Lisa, reaching out to take her hand, his fingers brushing against hers in a gesture of comfort. "We're almost there," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and lingering anger. "It's going to be okay." Lisa gave his hand a gentle squeeze, her eyes reflecting a resilience that reminded him of why he loved her. "I know," she murmured. "We'll get through this, together." With Thompson's car leading the way, they resumed their journey, the oppressive weight of fear and humiliation slowly lifting as the hospital came into view. But even as they approached their destination, Mark couldn't shake the bitterness in his chest, the sense of betrayal that still lingered. He had dedicated his life to the law, to the pursuit of justice, only to find himself at the mercy of men who had twisted that same law into a weapon of prejudice and cruelty. And while Thompson's intervention had brought a measure of justice, Mark knew that the battle was far from over. As they pulled into the hospital's parking lot, Thompson stepped out, waiting for them. He approached as Mark helped Lisa out of the car, his expression grave but supportive. "Mark, I'm going to file this report personally," Thompson said, his voice firm. "What those men did, it's unacceptable. They'll be held accountable, I promise." Mark nodded, his gaze fixed on the hospital doors. "Thank you, Jake. I appreciate it." Thompson clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. "Get her inside. I'll handle the rest." Mark gave him a grateful nod, then turned to Lisa, wrapping an arm around her as they walked through the hospital doors. The sterile lights and muted sounds of the emergency room felt surreal after the chaos of the past hour, but Mark welcomed the change, the sense of safety that the hospital walls provided. As they were ushered into a room, Lisa's face relaxed, her breathing steadying as the nurses began their work. Mark stayed by her side, his hand resting on hers, his gaze filled with a fierce protectiveness that no amount of violence could diminish. But even as he sat there, his focus on Lisa and their unborn child, his mind was already turning, plotting a course of action. This wasn't over. He would make sure that the men who had hurt his family faced the consequences of their actions. He would bring this case forward, fight for justice, not just for Lisa, but for every family who had suffered under the weight of prejudice and abuse. In that quiet room, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment and the soft murmur of voices, Mark made a silent promise to himself. He would be their voice, their shield, their advocate, and no matter what it took, he would ensure that change would come. Lisa looked over at him, her eyes softening as she saw the determination etched across his face. She reached out, her fingers curling around his hand, grounding him in the moment. "We're going to be all right," she whispered, her voice a balm to his soul. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together." Mark looked at her, a wave of gratitude washing over him. In her eyes, he saw hope, strength, a reminder of everything he was fighting for. And in that moment, he knew that, together, they could weather any storm. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital room, a stark contrast to the chaos and brutality they had just endured. Mark sat by Lisa's side, his hand gently holding hers as he watched the rise and fall of her chest. Her breaths were steadier now, her face relaxed as the nurses prepared her for delivery, but the shadow of what had happened lingered in both their minds. Lisa turned to look at him, a faint smile gracing her lips despite the exhaustion and pain that still lined her face. "We're here, Mark," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "We're safe." He managed a small nod, but his heart felt heavy. Safe. The word echoed in his mind, a bitter reminder of how fragile that sense of safety was, how quickly it could be shattered. The image of those officers, the sneering contempt on their faces, the way they had treated his wife, those memories were burned into his mind, a fresh wound that refused to heal. As a nurse entered, adjusting monitors and checking Lisa's vitals, Mark allowed himself to let go of her hand, if only for a moment. He stepped away, his gaze drifting toward the small window that overlooked the city, its lights twinkling in the darkness. In his reflection, he could see the faint bruises on his face, the subtle cuts where he had been forced against the pavement. He had endured physical pain before, but the weight in his chest, the bitterness gnawing at him, was something he struggled to bear. Images from the past flashed through his mind, moments he had kept buried, scars that he had learned to live with. The taunts he'd endured as a young recruit, the subtle slights and microaggressions, the dismissive glances, all of it resurfaced, adding to the pain of the present. He thought of the countless times he'd defended the integrity of his precinct, the times he had proudly spoken of his profession, of his belief in justice and fairness. But tonight, he had been stripped of that pride, his sense of duty shattered by men who wore the same uniform. "Captain?" The sound of the nurse's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see her watching him with a gentle, sympathetic expression. She nodded toward Lisa, a hint of reassurance in her eyes. "Your wife is strong. She's going to be just fine. You don't need to worry." He managed a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. As the nurse left, he returned to Lisa's side, his gaze softening as he looked down at her. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his, grounding him, pulling him back from the edge of his anger. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You shouldn't have had to go through that. I couldn't protect you." Lisa's fingers tightened around his, her gaze steady. "Mark, don't do this to yourself. This wasn't your fault." He closed his eyes, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. He had trained his whole life to protect others, to stand as a shield between people and harm. But when it came to his own family, he had been powerless, stripped of authority, humiliated. The realization cut him deeper than any wound he had ever sustained in the line of duty. "You trusted me to keep you safe," he said, his voice barely audible. "And I couldn't stop them." Lisa's hand cupped his cheek, her touch gentle, grounding. "Mark, look at me," she murmured. "This wasn't about you. It was about them. Their hatred, their prejudice. Don't carry that burden." Her words, filled with resilience, struck a chord within him, stirring a flicker of hope in the midst of his despair. But the anger, the sense of betrayal, was still there, simmering beneath the surface. He thought of the men he had worked with, the officers he had trusted, the ideals he had once believed in. The world he had dedicated himself to now felt foreign, tainted. He had always known there were problems, cracks in the system, but tonight had revealed a deeper rot, a darkness that threatened to consume everything he held dear. As he sat there, lost in thought, Lisa's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. "Mark, you can't let this define you. Don't let them take away who you are." He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, he saw the strength that had drawn him to her all those years ago. She was right. He couldn't let this break him. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for people who couldn't protect themselves, and he couldn't give up now. But a new resolve began to form within him, a sense of purpose fueled by the injustice he had witnessed. He would bring this case forward, not just for Lisa and their unborn child, but for every person who had been silenced, who had suffered in the shadows. He would expose the corruption, fight for change, even if it meant challenging the very foundation of the system he had served. "I'm going to file a report," he said, his voice steady, filled with determination. "I'll make sure those officers face the consequences of what they did. This can't happen again. Not to us, not to anyone." Lisa gave him a nod, her expression a mixture of pride and relief. "I know you will, and I'll be with you every step of the way." In that quiet hospital room, Mark made a vow. He would fight for justice, for his family, for every person who had been wronged. He would stand as a voice against the darkness, no matter the cost. And as he looked at Lisa, he knew that together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The nurse entered the room again, a gentle smile on her face. "It's time," she said, her voice warm, filled with an unspoken encouragement. Mark took a deep breath, giving Lisa's hand a reassuring squeeze. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for, the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. Despite the pain, despite the anger, he felt a renewed sense of hope, a reminder of the love that had brought them here. As he stood by her side, watching the first signs of their child's arrival, he knew that this child would be born into a world still marred by prejudice, still tainted by injustice. But he also knew that he would do everything in his power to make that world a better place, to fight for a future where his child could grow up without fear, without hatred. And as their child's first cries filled the room, Mark felt a surge of emotion unlike anything he had ever known. This was what he was fighting for, the reason he would continue to stand against the darkness. His family, his future, his legacy. He held Lisa's hand, and his gaze locked on their newborn, his heart filled with a fierce, unyielding love. This was only the beginning. The morning sun filtered through the hospital room's blinds, casting soft rays across the sterile walls. Mark sat in a daze, his exhaustion palpable, yet his heart was full in a way he hadn't known was possible. In his arms, bundled in a pale pink hospital blanket, was his newborn daughter. She was tiny, fragile, her skin soft and warm against his fingers as he traced the delicate line of her cheek. Lisa, lying in the hospital bed beside him, looked up with a tired but contented smile. Her face was etched with both the strain of the night and the joy of holding their child. She reached over, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she watched them both, her eyes glistening with tears. "Look at her, Mark," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "She's perfect." Mark felt his heart swell, a deep, fierce protectiveness rising within him. In that moment, nothing else mattered. The long hours of fear, the humiliation they'd endured, the fury simmering just beneath the surface. Everything faded into insignificance as he looked down at the tiny life cradled in his arms. She was the embodiment of hope, a new beginning, a reason to keep fighting. But even as he held her, the events of the night weighed on him, a reminder of the battles that lay ahead. His gaze hardened as he thought of the officers who had hurt his family, who had treated them with such callous disregard. He knew he couldn't let it go, couldn't simply move on and pretend it hadn't happened. Not now. Not when he had a daughter whose future depended on the changes he had long hoped to see in the world. "We're going to make this world better for her," he said softly, his voice steady, filled with conviction. "I'm going to make sure of it." Lisa nodded, her expression serious, a glint of pride in her eyes. "I know you will," she replied, her voice filled with quiet determination. "But you don't have to do it alone." Mark met her gaze, a sense of solidarity passing between them. They had always been partners, not just in marriage, but in their shared ideals, their commitment to justice. And now, with their daughter's future at stake, he knew that together they could face anything. A soft knock on the door broke the silence, and Mark looked up to see Detective Jake Thompson standing there, his expression somber. He stepped into the room, his gaze falling briefly on the newborn in Mark's arms before shifting to meet Mark's eyes. "Mark," he greeted, his voice low, respectful. "I wanted to check in, see how you and Lisa are doing, and to talk about last night." Mark nodded, a mixture of gratitude and resolve in his expression. "Thanks, Jake. We're doing all right, but last night—" He trailed off, glancing at Lisa before turning back to Thompson, his jaw set in determination. "It can't just end there. Those officers need to be held accountable." Thompson gave a slow nod, his face darkening as he thought back to the events he had witnessed. "I understand, Mark. What they did, it was beyond unacceptable." He hesitated, his gaze flickering briefly to the baby before returning to Mark. "I filed an initial report last night, but if you're serious about pursuing this, it's going to be a fight. You know how the system works. They'll try to bury it, protect their own." Mark's gaze hardened, his grip tightening slightly around his daughter. "I don't care. They crossed a line, Jake. I won't let them get away with it." Thompson regarded him for a long moment, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I figured you'd say that." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipping it open. I've already started gathering evidence. Witness statements, any security footage from nearby cameras, body cam footage from the officers involved, anything that can back up our case. Mark felt a surge of gratitude, the weight of Thompson's loyalty settling heavily on him. This fight wouldn't be easy. He knew that the system was stacked against them, that every step would be met with resistance. But, with Thompson by his side, he felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief that justice was within reach. "Thank you, Jake," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Thompson waved his hand dismissively, his smile widening. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a long road ahead of us, but if anyone can make a change, it's you, Mark, and I'll be there every step of the way." As Thompson left, Mark turned back to Lisa, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and determination. Their daughter stirred in his arms, a tiny yawn escaping her lips, and he felt a fierce surge of protectiveness rise within him. This wasn't just about justice. It was about building a world where his daughter could grow up safe, where she wouldn't have to live in fear, where she could believe in the values he had once held dear. He gently passed their daughter to Lisa, leaning over to kiss her forehead before straightening, his gaze steady, resolute. He knew that this fight would be long, that it would challenge him in ways he had never imagined, but he also knew that he couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. "Are you ready?" Lisa asked, her voice soft but steady as though she sensed the depth of his resolve. Mark nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes," he replied, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "We're going to do this, not just for us, but for her, and for everyone else who deserves a fair chance." And with that, he made a silent promise, one that he knew would guide him in the months and years to come. He would be their voice, their shield, their champion. He would fight for justice, for change, for a future where his daughter could walk proudly, without fear, without shame. And no matter how long it took, he would see that promise through. As the morning light filled the room, casting a warm glow over his family, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was only the beginning, the first step on a journey that would test him in every way imaginable. But with Lisa by his side and their daughter in his arms, he knew that he could face whatever lay ahead. And with each step, he would carry the strength of his family, their love, their resilience, guiding him forward. In the weeks that followed, Mark and Thompson began building their case, navigating the labyrinthine procedures and red tape that sought to protect the guilty. They faced obstacles at every turn: intimidation, resistance from within the department, attempts to discredit them. But they pressed on, fueled by a determination that only grew stronger with each challenge. And slowly, as the truth began to surface, as witnesses stepped forward, as evidence mounted, the tide began to turn. News of the case spread, sparking a wave of public outrage, a demand for justice that could not be silenced. Mark knew that there was still a long road ahead, that change would not come overnight. But as he looked into his daughter's eyes, he felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief in the future he was fighting to build. He had found his purpose, his calling, and he knew that, together, they could change the world. For his daughter, for his family, for the countless others who had been silenced, he would keep fighting. And one day, he knew, they would see the dawn of a new era, a world where justice and compassion prevailed, a world he had always dreamed of. If you liked this story, support the channel by subscribing so you don't miss new episodes. Watch our other videos as well. Each story raises important topics and makes you think. Stay tuned for more updates.